Those things are very difficult to learn. And just as you mentioned, I think it's particularly difficult for a first-time administrator, first-time city manager, what have you. Part of the challenge is even recognizing when there's a fork in the road and you're supposed to be learning something. A lot of the times you won't until you look backwards on that point.
Mm-hmm.
You are listening to Manager Brothers Lessons Learned. Twice each month, Gregg and Jae draw on their combined 80-plus years of state and local government work experience to help listeners avoid the pitfalls they and others have unwittingly stumbled into. And now, on to the episode.
Well, welcome to another episode of Manager Brothers Lessons Learned. This is Gregg Gutcho, and joining me is my brother Jae Gutcho. Jae, say hi.
Hello.
Is that enough for people to identify your voice, Jae?
Hopefully, it sounds taller.
Well, that will be completely meaningless to at least some of the people that, and just to kind of fill in, Jae is a foot taller than I am. I think he used to be just like 11 inches, but I think I've shrunk in the meantime, and I don't sure think he has. But
I haven't caught up to you.
Yeah, well, I don't know that we can live long enough to where we both, disappear entirely. Well, without any further ado, and to rein this in and to interject a little seriousness here, we do have the very first time for Manager Brothers a guest that we are including here, and his name is James Gallagher. And so, James, why don't you do a little bit of introduction of yourself?
Well, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Just for an introduction, I'm James Gallagher. I've spent about 4.5 years in local government, executive leadership role. Before then, and what prompted me into this world was a bachelor's in political science from a local college here in Michigan, and then a master's degree in public administration, again from another Michigan college here. And part of that master's program was the choice to do a project for your capstone or an internship. And always the utilitarian, I thought, well, an internship would get me more exposure to the world, a little bit more experience. So I chose that route and did an internship. Had an excellent experience in a small city here in Michigan. Small, I say small, about 40,000 residents or so. But it was an excellent experience, and kind of went from there and took my my freshly earned degree into the job hunting world, landed a position as a local government executive, spent 4.5 years there, and just left that position about a year ago now, so very recently.
So you followed kind of a traditional route, well, and I say traditional because I also had a bachelor's in political science and a master's in public administration, but a lot of us have come that route when we want to go into city management or a related field. What was it that motivated, I mean, was that your interest when you went for the public administration degree?
That's a great question. I knew, so the short answer is no. The longer answer is I knew I wanted to do something in the either NGO space or government space or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then really didn't know how my degrees were going to line up with all of that. So that's what prompted me after my bachelor's to go into the Master's of Public Administration program was municipal executive leadership. So it was post undergrad when I was just struggling, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I discovered that city management, city executive leadership existed.
Yeah.
And that's what pushed me into the master's program and then into my role.
When I was finishing up my bachelor's, I had an idea that I wanted to go into urban planning. That was really what motivated me to begin thinking about what's after bachelor's and what am I going to do with the rest of my life. And I had a professor who I'd had for my intro to poli-sci who saw me outside of one of the buildings, and he said, well, what are you going to do now that you're going to graduate? And I told him urban planning, and he said, no, Western has just started up a public administration program. I really think you ought to be looking at city management. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. And then, about a year and a half later, when I enrolled in the public administration program there, it was for the purpose of going into city management. I had thought more about it, and I'd had some exposure in some of my political science classes, since I was focused mostly on urban politics, to the council manager form of government. So, I think some of those influences, including, I remember one class we had the Kalamazoo city manager come in and talk. He was one of the guest speakers in class. And so, there were those kinds of influences, and I think they all ultimately settled in. And eventually I saw the light and decided to pursue that. And 40 years later, finished up a career in city management for the most part. Jay, you've talked a little bit about your background, and we won't go into that in as much detail since we've covered that here, but you came into that idea to pursue municipal management through the elected side.
Yes, I took a lot longer to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I spent 32 years in state government before I slid on over, or actually took a step up, I should say, into municipal management. So I went back for my master's in public administration 30 years after I obtained my bachelor's degree, which was not in political science, it was in sociology and anthropology, so about as far removed as you can possibly get from municipal management.
Oh no, I don't. I can think of a lot of degrees that are further removed than that. You could have gone into fine arts or, English literature, philosophy. Any of those things would have been, a lot further away than than sociology and anthropology. Yeah. Those might actually be really good fields for someone going into this. And this is a little bit off topic, but it kind of raises an interesting idea, which is that a lot of us come to city management through a lot of different avenues, and not all of them follow the traditional path that I've just laid out, political science and an MPA. There are a lot of different ways that you can get into the field. It's just a matter of whatever sparks that interest and gets you going. So, James, you indicated in your introduction that you had jumped right in with both feet into a top-level executive position in a municipality right after you finished your internships that you were doing. So did you approach that with a little bit of trepidation, or did you feel that you were well prepared to take on that role?
Oh, I was well prepared. No, not at all. I was absolutely... I was terrified. The terror actually set in right as the phone call came in for offering me the position for the first time. And at that point, I had gone over in my head in just a moment all of my experience to that point, all of my education and tutelage, and thought, well, that's not nearly enough. I don't know what to do now.
Yeah.
So I was extremely worried. I was scared. I was nervous, mostly for leaving the role I had been in for that position meant that I was no longer responsible for my own failures, but my failures would become, paid for by somebody, right?
Yeah.
When you move into government, you're working for taxpayers, the citizenry, and the general populace who... if you fail, it falls on their shoulders in some way, right?
Right.
A bad policy or something of that nature. So I was scared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't think that's abnormal. I think that it's been long enough ago that I probably have blotted out most of the fear that I had once I started in my first manager position. Now, I will say that I was naive enough to think that getting hired on a 4-3 vote was not a bad thing. And I really honestly remember thinking that, I know what I'm doing. I had I'd done an internship that had turned into an administrative assistant position, so I had, a year and a half of experience or something along those lines before I actually landed my first manager job. But I actually was convinced that once the no votes on the council saw what I was capable of doing as a competent professional manager, that they would swing right along and be so thankful that they had hired me for that position, and that proved not to be true.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. One of the things you're not taught is those types of situations. When you're in school for things, and there is no city manager school,
Right.
But some of the things that you're taught are rules and laws, and to follow them, and how to research things. But you're not taught the softer things, the softer skills.
Yeah.
And recognizing things like that are critical.
Yeah. So what are some of the things besides that? Or maybe you can go into a little bit more detail on some of those soft skills. What are the things that you wished you'd known when you first, stepped foot in the office, as opposed to the things that, you kind of had to learn, as you went through that over that 4.5-year period of time?
Well, to just kind of carry the torch on that last topic was, those softer skills that you're not taught. I wish I had known how to navigate and deal with differing opinions. You're not always speaking for any one subset of stakeholders. In municipal management, you're often speaking for diverging and at times adversarial points of view. You have to take into account the citizenry, who may have one perspective. You have to take into account your council, who has hired you and has said to you that you are going to do what we tell you to. And then you also have to take into account the staff and the employees of that location, whom often either look up to you as their leader, and you should also look at the organization as somewhat of a shepherd for them, so that you can be a rock when things go wrong, and you can be an assistant to their needs. So those three perspectives, I wish I had known that those three are very often at odds. Very rarely are they all, wind pushing sails in one direction.
We'll return to Manager Brothers' lessons learned in a moment. Do you have a topic you would like Gregg and Jae to explore? Are you interested in being a guest on Lessons Learned? Do you have comments about this episode? You can write Gregg and Jae using the contact form at greggllc.com/lessons. That's greggllc.com/lessons.
James, I want to follow up your comments about the soft skills and ask you about when you think back to your internship in particular. Did that not provide you enough of an exploration of that aspect of management, do you think? Is that something that, as an intern, you just were insulated enough from those kinds of, citizen interactions or council policy and politics interactions that you really didn't, it was a little bit of an eye-opener when you actually got in there and were doing it yourself?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. The internship was pretty insulated. It was very much just skill-based and research-based, producing documents, editing things, to learn kind of the nuts and bolts side of what goes on.
Yep.
So it was I was maybe too insulated looking back. So those conversations they just did not occur.
Yeah. Well, I would assume that maybe you had a conversation with, the city manager or another high-level administrator in the organization where you were doing an internship. Did you have a conversation with them at all about, along the lines of, do you think I'm ready for my first manager job?
Actually, no. I think the city manager was interested in not really guiding me so much as letting me experience. And I say that with no malice at all, of course, because there was it was very short, first of all, which I lament looking back. But no, those opportunities for those discussions were not terribly frequent, and then the discussions were mostly related to the projects I was working on and how I felt about my work, and they weren't very forward-looking.
Jay, when you were when you were taking on your first manager job, municipal manager job, did you have the same kind of experience, or do you think that the time that you spent as an elected official and commission member, those kinds of things, do you think that those things prepared you well enough to know what to expect your first day in the office when it came to those soft skill kind of areas?
Well, as just briefly for James' benefit, I spent 3 years as an appointed official on the planning commission, and then was elected to the village council as a trustee for 2 years, and then was the village president for almost 6 years. So the combined time was about 10 years. But so I had developed a relationship with the village administrator, during that period of time. So I had a pretty good sense of what his role was because of being on the other side of the table, basically. So I had a bit of an idea, but what I've experienced with my various assignments is that, and I'm sure you can say the same thing. Each community is completely different from the other community, so you can't fully prepare for the politics and some of the other attributes, I guess, that play into each of our success in those communities. So, so I think I was maybe a little better prepared, for my first assignment, but not completely prepared. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's true of any of us, because you have a sense. But you don't know the unique culture of those individual communities. And so, there's something, I think I added up that I've worked in 8 or 9 different municipalities, and every one of them is different, and every one of them had a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a surprise. The story that I've told more than one time was that, when I moved from my first community to my second community, I was used to the mayor as the presiding officer having a particular way in which the meeting was run based on my first experience. Well, the new mayor came in, or I'm working in a new community, the mayor, that's not how it was done at all. And so there was a completely different expectation about what that interaction is between the manager and the mayor at a meeting. And I was a slow learner because I got to my third community and I was still thinking about my second community. And I remember my first meeting, I'm sitting there waiting for the mayor to introduce the next item on the agenda, and the mayor's waiting for me to introduce the next item on the agenda because that's the way it had always been done in that community. I learned afterwards that, maybe it's a good idea to have a conversation with the mayor before the first council meeting and find out exactly how they do things here. So, those are all things that you can easily get over fairly quickly, but it's some of those little surprises and in some cases not so little surprises that come along. So talk about, James, getting back to you, what are some of the other maybe little or not so little surprises that sort of pop into your mind when you think back to as you're first getting started in that role?
Oh, probably one of the things that comes to mind is there's lots of ways to do something, and when you discover that something had been done a certain way, and you continue that certain way out of convention, and for me it was just again lack of experience, lack of knowledge. What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? And then you realize, oh, that was just done this way because it was. You can do it any other way.
Yeah.
And then the doors open and the lights turn on, and everything from that point of view, from that point in time, changes slightly, and you're given a little bit more a breadth of freedom with how you do things. That was something I had to learn. It took me a little while, but that was a very interesting thing. You know, any idiosyncratic process
Right.
can change.
How long had the person, your predecessor in that role, how long had that individual been in that position before you came there?
Yeah, in total about 30 years.
Right.
So there was, when I say convention, they were carved. There were some hard and fast things that were just done in certain ways, and they were very, very difficult to change. Some not so,
Right.
But the ones that had been very much set in.
Yeah, I think you just encounter that there are certain sacred items that you know it's a part of the gospel for that place that it takes a lot of effort to change some of those things, and particularly there may be allegiances yet to the former manager. There are people that I would assume that that manager had hired that were still on staff that you inherited, and that's you're going to hear that. Oh, that's not the way we used to do it, or that's not the way it was done here before, that kind of thing.
Oh, often, daily. So
Yeah.
that was very much a challenge.
Well, and if every community was a cookie cutter of another, then these jobs wouldn't have the challenges, So
Yeah. One of the things that I've always marveled at, and it's probably because I have worked in smaller municipalities, and you do tend to inherit the staff and whatever, but, talking to managers or hearing from managers that have gone into larger cities where it's expected that they're going to bring their own team of people in with them. They're going to, move people out of roles. They're not, they oftentimes are getting hired with an expectation that there will be changes. And I remember this was at an awards ceremony that I was involved in some years ago, where a city manager was being honored for his contributions to the field of public administration. And among the speakers who was talking about him, who I think may have been the one that had nominated him for this award, got up and said, "When we hired him, I told him to be bold." And that's not something you oftentimes, at least in my experience, I've never had a council and a mayor say to me, Greg, we want you to be bold. Make all the changes you think you need to make here, and let's do some radical things here. I've never heard nobody's ever said that to me.
That takes a brave person to put their trust in someone to say, be bold,
Yep.
especially with these roles. Like you said, there are lots of allegiances and attachments to certain things, and they are sacred and they shouldn't be touched. But
Yep.
again, that's the challenge in these roles, is sometimes they need to.
Yeah, and that's, from my perspective, and you might not agree, but that's a part of the fun of it as well. If you can, keep your head above water, the idea that it's a learning experience, you've got to figure out what's the right way to do it here. How do I change this culture gradually over time? I think that's there's actually. That's actually some of the challenge of it as we get into these things. So let me ask you, James, as we're approaching kind of getting close to the end of our time here talking, if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently?
Oh, well, we certainly don't have enough time for me to exhaust that list. Well, so this will be from, remember the perspective here is I that was my first role, and to date only in that particular executive leadership function. So it's going to come with that set of biases, but a wise manager who I had gotten to know over the 4 years or so I was in that role had said, you advocate for your city every single day, some 2,000 hours a year you spend on that behalf. It is very important that you advocate for yourself in times when that's necessary. The topic in that circumstance was, contract negotiations, but it's also important in just the day-to-day when things happen that, just because your job relies on a vote doesn't mean you shouldn't stand up for yourself when you see fit. And so that's something I would have, I wish I would have done over again, was be a little bit more assertive and be a little bit more protecting of myself when those certain circumstances arose, and that would have been beneficial for me for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jay, you had an experience like that, as I remember in your career, having to, I think, throw a council member out of your office at one point.
Yes. Yeah, and there were other times when I wanted to throw a council member out of my office too. But anyway, no, where I had was actually where I was an acting city manager, and a council member came in. I can't remember exactly what motivated them to come in necessarily, but there'd been a conflict where she had publicly in the local newspaper criticized the clerk and the treasurer, which were under my purview as the acting manager. And so there was a confrontation that occurred, and went on for about 20 minutes, I would say. And so it was. I stood up. I stood up not only for myself, but I stood up for all of my staff, because she was just attacking everybody, and it was I guess it was just my reaction. I must have been fairly eloquent, and she eventually stormed out of the office, and up and down the hallway was spontaneous applause from all of my staff. So anyway, so I thought, wow, it took a turn for the. I mean, I knew this was not going to bode well with my future there, but it worked out well, and that's where you have to hang on to your integrity when necessary, even though it may jeopardize your position.
Yeah, and I think that's a little, frankly, I think that trying to do that kind of thing, or trying to stand up for yourself, I think is especially hard for a manager that's newer in his or her career. You're still learning as you go. You're still developing a sense of who you are, and you're still developing confidence in your own abilities. And I think that as good as that advice is, I think that is a tough thing to try to do, to represent yourself and watch out for yourself. But I think these are difficult jobs, and I think there are times when you really do need to put yourself forward. And I certainly have had occasions when I have had difficult conversations with elected officials, and at least one of them that comes to mind was during a council meeting. And so those things do kind of come along. I will add, in terms of it's only fair that I answer the question as well as to what I would do differently. And I think that the one thing that I realized, and it's worked out fine for me, but I think that from a career standpoint, but I think that I went too quickly into that first manager job, and I think I would have been well served by staying longer in an administrative assistant role, or getting into an assistant manager role in a larger municipality, and gaining a little bit more skill and a little bit more capability. I think I thought going in that I knew the technical requirements of the job, and the municipality where I worked was very supportive. We didn't have a lot of the kinds of political issues that I ultimately did encounter in other locations, and so I think it wasn't a broad enough experience. I had the technical skills. I felt good about the technical skills. I knew how to do that stuff, but I feel that I would have been much more effective had I spent a little bit more time learning about the soft skill side of things and seeing it from another perspective in a different community, one that maybe was facing some challenges that the community where I did my internship and served as administrative assistant didn't have.
Those things are very difficult to learn, and just as you mentioned, I think it's particularly difficult for a first-time administrator, first-time city manager, what have you. Part of the challenge is even recognizing when there's a fork in the road and you're supposed to be learning something. A lot of the times you won't until you look backwards on that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, despite I will say, despite the fact that you've decided that being that top executive is in a local government is not where you want to be right now. When I talk James, I think that's an opportunity that remains available to you at some other time. And I think that I think I can speak for both of us that there are opportunities for people like you to come back into the field. We certainly need people to be involved in the trenches on the day-to-day, on a day-to-day basis, helping run cities and run villages and townships and the like. I think there's important work that we do there. So I'll keep in touch and tell you to keep. I'll ask you sometime. Is it time for you to jump back in there and do that again?
Yeah, and I do look forward to that point in time. I have not written the profession off. It was, a lot of the topics that come up for discussion about the profession are that it's so challenging, but it is also extremely rewarding. Mm-hmm. It is fulfilling, and part of the job is you get to learn, you get to problem solve, you get to work for the betterment of your fellow citizen, and all of those altruistic things that we latch onto as kids. And the world is great.
Yep.
You get to try to put into practice every day.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with that. Continues to motivate me.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, that was a great summary, James. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
James, any other final words before we move to concluding this episode?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come on. I hope I was answering the questions in the way you'd hoped, or at least giving you something to chew on.
Yeah, well, the whole idea is to have those perspectives out there for the listeners that we have, and particularly any of those that might be thinking about, whether they're thinking about going into this profession. I think giving a little bit of perspective there, and it's certainly in keeping with the lessons learned theme that we decided was important for this. I do want to indicate, James, that we do have a sponsor for this episode, which is the Wolfsbane Music Festival, which is held the first 2 weeks of August each year in Tanglefoot, Massachusetts. And I think you might be interested in this. A highlight of the 2024 festival will be the world premiere of Modest Mouse Plays Modest Mussorgsky. This is a work that was commissioned through generous contributions received from a GoFundMe solicitation. Modest Mouse, which is a rock band, will join the Wolfsbane Chamber Orchestra to offer the band's interpretations of selections from Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain and Pictures at an Exhibition. I think that's a really interesting approach to modern classical music these days. So that's remember, the first 2 weeks of August in each year is when that's held. So you'll have to go online and look and see how you get tickets for that. The next episode that we will have is going to focus on freebies. What are the things that cross the manager's desk where somebody's making an offer to give you something, and in some cases with some expectation for continued business or those kinds of things? How do you handle that? I've got a number of examples that relate to that, and one particularly challenging one that came my way. So we'll be chatting about that, Jay. I'm sure that you have some examples as well that you'll be able to reference as we get into that.
Yep, certainly.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up here. Once again, thanks to our guest, James Gallagher, for joining us. And we hope you'll tune in to the next episode of Manager Brothers Lessons Learned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Manager Brothers Lessons Learned is a production of Gregg Guidance, LLC, a multi-specialty consulting firm offering interim management, group process facilitation, workflow analysis, operational studies, and more to local governments in Michigan and beyond.